want to, of course, welcome all of you here. This is probably the biggest crowd we've had at one of our meetings. And I know you're anticipating the story that our presenters have to tell.
We're going to talk about his book. And as we approach it, there's a certain timeline involved. Enlisted in 1862. Becomes part of the 83rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry Regiment. It's mainly a regiment out of Cincinnati. If you're looking for a regiment from Mercer County, the 71st Regiment. The regiment usually has about 1,000 guys in it. The 83rd had 1,010 people in it. The 71st had 2.5 companies out of Mercer County, about 250 people out of 1,000 in it. Van Wert had its regiment was the 46th. It had a company and a half in the 46th. There were, so most of the people that he is serving with are from down around Cincinnati. There was one guy named Wesley Brennan who was from Van Wert, who served with him, or served in the same regiment. Now when we go through this, I want to go through my, so what we're going to cover, I'm going to cover the period of time before his capture. And the book is mainly about his time as a POW. I'm going to talk a little bit about his experiences before his capture. Mr. Minnick is going to pick it up there and talk about his experiences at Camp Ford. Camp Ford became the largest Confederate prison camp west of the Mississippi. And Mrs. Howell will then pick up. He is sent to another prison camp from Camp Ford. Mrs. Howell will talk about his experiences at Camp Gross. These are basically the heart of the presentation, his time, as the title says, as a prisoner of the rebels in Texas. Afterward, I want to talk a little bit about his experiences in the war after his release. He does have experiences in the war after his release. We want to take some time, we're supposed to be historians, and evaluate this book as a historical source and a literary source. And then to finally end up talking a little bit about his post-war experiences. He is a member then of this 83rd Regiment out of Cincinnati, the Greyhounds, a nickname they picked up because of the speed of their marches. And this, you see the Greyhound symbol. This is Mr. Joe Falk, who at our school helped me find out exactly what this symbol meant. For about a year and a half in their service, they were part of the 13th Army Corps as part of the Department of the Tennessee. These were their original leading officers. Colonel Moore was the original commander. He's later promoted up to brigade leader. And Lieutenant Colonel Baldwin here becomes the commander of the regiment later on in the war. They begin their service at Camp Dennison outside of Cincinnati. They're trained there. They're sent to the south. They come under the command of Ulysses S. Grant. And they serve in his campaign around Vicksburg, which is one of the major campaigns, maybe the major campaign in the whole western part of the Civil War. They have their first major combat at a place called Chickasaw Bayou in December of 1862, and they are then involved in a series of battles in and around Vicksburg as this campaign to take the city. The city is considered of unlimited importance. capture of Vicksburg will give the North control of the Mississippi River and split the Confederacy in half. And so this is an extended campaign that takes place over a 7-month period, and the 83rd is part of that campaign. Finally, on July 4th, Vicksburg falls, and a few days after that, in July 16th, they are involved, the 83rd is involved in the taking of Jackson, Mississippi, the capital of Mississippi. At that time, Sutton, Mr. Sutton is Corporal Sutton, as of March of 1863. He is given a furlough and sent home. He comes back to duty in 1864. When he does, Grant has left command. He's been promoted. He's been brought to the east to command the whole of the Union armies. And he's been replaced by William Tecumseh Sherman, another outstanding commander. And if it had remained that way, it probably would have been a pretty good deal for Mr. Sutton. This guy knew his business. The problem for Mr. Sutton in the 83rd was that they were transferred from Mr. Sherman's command, General Sherman's command, to that of General Nathaniel Banks. Nathaniel Banks was in command of the Gulf area, and he was to begin a campaign up the Red River, which I'll show you that in a second. This guy's background: Grant, Sherman are West Pointers. This guy is a political general. He had been the governor of Massachusetts. That was his military. He was set to go. And he was commanding this expedition. And this is a complicated expedition, actually. It is heading up. They want to get to the They basically want to get into the areas with the most cotton production, and one of these areas is in eastern Texas. And they're heading up the Red River. It's the Red River campaign. And it's a combined campaign. It includes not just the Army, 35,000 soldiers. Gravity is against me. It is a combined campaign. They're moving up the river with naval and Army forces, heading into, the goal is to head up this river into Texas and to get control of these cotton areas. And as they go up there, it becomes increasingly obvious that Banks doesn't know what he's doing, that these men are ill-led. There are a series of defeats, and then the one that's going to have the biggest effect on Mr. Sutton as they come to a place called Mansfield, Louisiana. At this site, one of my competitors.
Well, as he indicated that Sutton in 83rd Ohio, this leadership of William Tecumseh Sherman, and freshmen, we studied William Tecumseh Sherman and his march to the sea, so we know what type of general he is. Nathaniel Banks is anything but a leader. And exactly where he left off is Sutton and the 83rd are pushed into a battle near Pleasant Hills, and this is near Mansfield. The 83rd is put on the extreme right, okay? And Company A, Sutton's company, and Company F are put out as skirmishes. Well, in the battle that ensues, everything goes to pot. Okay, the main core retreats. It leaves this extreme right, and the skirmishes just left out in the open. The Confederates are charging down. So if you can imagine mass chaos, what do? Well, Sutton took it upon himself to take off running. But the problem is he ran right into a Confederate brigade. Okay? So he's going to be captured. He's captured. And the general of the Reb Army, or of this brigade, puts one man in charge of Sutton. Well, as we find out throughout this whole story, Sutton doesn't give up. Okay? And the general instructed the guard to march Sutton back to, march him back to the pen where the other prisoners are going to be held. As they're coming down a hill, Sutton's already sizing up this guy, thinking of a way to overtake him. And as they come down this hill, Sutton does just that. He steps to the side, trips the guy, kicks the wind out of him, grabs his gun and the gun of the guard, and takes off running. So this is his first escape. Okay? He runs, he eludes some cavalry, he misses a couple ambulance divisions out picking up some ill people, but he's captured again. And he's led to a pen where 1,300 prisoners are kept. 1,300 prisoners. Just to tell you about the battle and how it was mismanaged by Nathaniel Banks, 1,300 are held captive. Okay, it was just a mess to begin with. Getting ahead of myself. There's actually a funny story about his first escape. Is, remember I said he kicked the wind out of that guard. Well, he didn't kill the guard. And the guard was actually later chasing him before he was captured. Well, when he was taken to the pen with the other 1,300 people, he found a bunch of the 83rd Ohioans, and he says, "Here, take my shirt." He found a friend, he says, "Take my shirt, swap me shirts." And he explained that if that guard came looking for him, he was going to notice Sutton's rank and pick him out and possibly, beat him, torture him. So they switched shirts just for a short time to keep him from being punished. Now, the 1,300 captives are going to be marched to Tyler, Texas. Camp Ford, outside of Tyler, Texas, is right here's Tyler. Okay? And they're going to, that's where Camp Ford's at. I'm going to give you the background of Camp Ford in a second, but I got to start talking about his journey to the camp. Sutton is very keen with his thoughts. He doesn't ever miss a deal. The first thing he grabs is a rubber blanket. Okay? Obviously the blanket's going to keep him warm. The second thing he finds is a saddlebag. A saddlebag that goes on a horse. Now that saddlebag is going to come in handy because when they stop along the path going to Tyler, they're issued their rations. Prisoners got rations, okay, usually a lot less than that of the soldier would, but a prisoner still got rations. And they were issued pots and pans that they could cook with. Well, the pots and pans were collected at night. Where the saddlebag comes in handy is there were very few pans and a lot of prisoners. So you had to wait your turn. And in fact, when you got your ration, some men went to bed hungry and woke up in the middle of the night when the pan was free and cooked their meal that way. But Sutton kept that pan. He didn't give it back to the Confederates. And he and the 83rd used that pan, and they took turns hiding it amongst their persons all the way to Tyler, Texas, Camp Ford. Now, the background of Camp Ford is this. Camp Ford is located 4 miles northeast of Tyler, Texas. It was first established as a training camp. By 1863, it was largely inactive. Then on August 27th, 1863, it began its history as a POW camp. The first group of prisoners were federal officers. In November 1863, the prison went from 2 to 6 acres. To April 1864, it expanded to 8 acres. Now I got a picture to show that here in a second. But the problem comes with this prison camp is the number of prisoners that keep getting added and added and added. Okay? Here's the numbers. Due to Nathaniel Banks and his poor mismanagement of his army and some other blunders that happened along the way, the camp originally started out in 1863 and 64 with 130 prisoners, mostly officers who had comfortable living conditions. Well, then in March 30th of that year, 1864, it increased by 760 enlisted men now. Now, April 15th through 18th, when Sutton was taken to Camp Ford, 1,675 men joined the camp. And it keeps increasing. May 15th, another 1,200 men. May 24th, 490 men. June 7th, 4,732 men. And by July 6th, 4,900 men in this camp. This camp is not equipped to handle that many prisoners. And we're going to talk about it as we go along. So, here's Camp Ford. Picture of it here. Kind of give you a basic outline of the camp. Just got some fences up. It's got a stream outside the camp that is actually going to help keep the prisoners alive. Because when we talk later on about another prison that he goes to, there is no fresh water. There's no clean water. So at Camp Ford, for the most part, the living conditions weren't bad at first, but they get worse as time goes on. Some of the cabins at first for the officers were as elaborate as this. This looks like a log cabin, okay? This looks like the one possibly down at Shane's Park uptown here. But other type of structures that we see, this is called a she-bang or a lean-to. This is an A-frame type of building, and we're actually going to see the buildings diminish in quality as more and more people come into camp. One more thing I want to point out here. We're going to get to it in a second, but remember these 3 graves I'm pointing out, okay? Remember those 3 graves. When Sutton and the rest of the 83rd reached Tyler, Texas, they found an abundant water supply outside, as I mentioned. And it was a cool spring that ran through the middle of the camp. The 83rd was assigned to a spot to eat, drink, and have roll call. This place was near what they called Keno Corner. We're going to talk about gambling in the prison here, and Keno Corner is one of the famous spots in all of Camp Ford. Sutton doesn't partake, by the way. We'll get to that. Sutton steps up as a leader. He steps up as a leader and he organizes the building of a she-bang or a lean-to for the 83rd of Company A to sleep in. So he takes it upon himself to build a structure for them. All right. This diagram, this is actually a great illustration of the camp. As the camp grew, this dotted line is what it originally started out as. But as more and more prisoners came, it just kept expanding and expanding. So the dotted line is the original prison camp, and then the other 8 acres, or it's going to expand to 8 acres, and that's shown up there. By June of that year, the camp was holding nearly 5,300 prisoners. That was quite a bit more than when Sutton first arrived. When he first arrived, there were 600. Many men, so many men were coming in, many men would just dig a hole in the ground to sleep in. They'd dig a hole in the ground and pull some brush over the top of them, just to shade them from the hot temperatures, maybe to keep the rain off of them. But if we dig a hole in the ground, where's that rain going to go? Into the hole. So men were actually digging into the side of the creek bank as well, into a tunnel. Others had some actual houses. Others, most of them, had lean-tos. Now, the guards I want to talk about here. The guards and the colonel, they had a strict rules, regulations that they followed. When the camp originally started with few prisoners of war there, it was guarded by actual soldiers. Well, as we know, as the Civil War progressed, those able-bodied soldiers were taken away from guarding a prison camp and put onto the front lines. So who stayed behind was young men, young boys, and the elderly men to guard the camp. But here's a list of the prison rules and regulations that the guards had to follow. Now, there are four accounts where prisoners were murdered, executed for little or no reason. Now, the colonel that I'm about to show you comes out and he says, those that murder without cause, without catching somebody escaping, without striking a guard or an officer, without cause will be punished. But history will actually show us those who committed one of these murders actually moved up in rank. Okay? And the other story I want to tell you about the guard is there's a 12-year-old boy. A 12-year-old boy who promises his mother, I will kill a Yankee before I return home. And they're stuck to guard these prison camps. We call that an itchy trigger finger. Okay? Now, the commander. When Sutton arrives, Colonel Allen is going to be the commander of Camp 4. And Sutton is going to, time after time after time, write about this special rapport he has with Colonel Allen, the old colonel, as he calls him. As soon as Sutton and the 83rd arrive at Camp 4, he petitions to Colonel Allen to let him go outside and cut down some trees, split those trees into rails, and make that lean-to for the 83rd. He also petitions to, later on we're going to talk about how the filth and the mess is building up in the cabin. Sutton writes that he talks to the old colonel personally and gets a wagon and gets a cart to remove that filth. But I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. But just remember, I mentioned he had a direct conversation with Colonel Allen. It's just another picture of him. That's the mustache I want to grow. I would. Now, I want to talk about Sutton. This man was an entrepreneur, to say the least. He would not let a deal go by. I mentioned that earlier. Sutton arrived at camp with $40 in his pocket. Okay? First thing he buys is he buys sulfur from one of the rebel guards. This sulfur was to cure something called the itch. Okay? I don't know what type of itch he had, but sulfur took care of it. So he spent $5 to acquire this sulfur. He also bought some tobacco with his money that he had. And he shared the sulfur and the tobacco with the other 83rd boys. So he kind of steps up as this leader and really takes care of the men that was serving with him. But he saves $5. He holds on to $5. And with that last $5, he came up with a way to generate more money, to generate income. He buys a pair of shears for $5 so he can cut people's hair. Now, who goes to prison and thinks it's a beauty contest? Okay? The first thing, I'm not going to prison, but if I went to prison, I wouldn't worry about getting my hair cut on the first day. But there's actually a great desire, there was a great need to keep your hair short. Because the longer it got, the more dirt, the more filth, the lice set in, disease. So men would pay to have their hair cut. Well, again, Sutton being an entrepreneur, he buys with his last $5 a pair of shears. And he teams up with an Irishman from the 83rd, and his name is James Doan. Well, Doan doesn't cut hair, but Doan shaves. So they set up a shop next to the Keno corner, next to the gambling corner. Sutton would cut the hair, and Doan would shampoo and shave. All the money collected was divided in half. Each man, Sutton and Doan, walked away every day with $5. Now that is big time money. He kept his cash flow going, which allowed him to buy things that he didn't have. We'll talk about that here in a second. He has a lot of money. Remember, he has a lot of money because he is faring a lot better than the other prisoners in the camp. Camp 4 ration and the food that they received, there is no official record. There's no official record of the rations that they got. But there are several different personal accounts where it says cornmeal, beef, and a small amount of salt were given every day. The more people that came to the prison, the less rations you got. That just makes sense. You got more mouths to feed with only the same amount of beef, you're going to get less. Well, personal accounts said at the beginning, when Sutton was there, he was receiving about a pound of cornmeal and a pound of beef per day. Towards the end, he was only receiving about 3 to 4 ounces of cornmeal and 3 to 4 ounces of beef, no salt. Their diet lacked simple things like fruits and vegetables, okay? Which is actually going to lead to a lot of problems. You just can't live off of beef. You just can't live off of cornmeal. But, however bad Camp Ford was, it was much, much better than Andersonville. And if you know anything about Andersonville, what state? Georgia. Georgia. Andersonville in Georgia. Horrible, horrible conditions. Resembled that freshman of what we studied in Nazi Germany. Okay. Camp Ford experiences trade. What Sutton couldn't acquire, see, he would take that money and he would buy extra rations and he would feed himself and he would feed more of the 83rd people. But what he was ultimately doing was he's buying extra rations and drying the beef and saving his cornmeal because he's planning an escape. He's not going to sit there and be a prisoner. He's going to strike out and he's going to make it back to the Union lines. So he makes that money and he spends it buying rations and things he needs. And he's actually keeping himself healthy by acquiring things that other prisoners don't. Now what he can't buy, he trades. He was a great manipulator as well. In fact, he would go to the butcher and he would get some fat. And he would go and get some bones and burn it down to ash. The older people in the crowd here know what I'm talking about, and he's going to make his own soap. Okay? He makes his own soap. Then he gets a knife and he cuts the old colonel's horse's tail, and makes a brush out of that horsehair so he can lather up and shave. Again, everything makes money for him, keeping him healthier, keeping him alive. Now, let's talk about the gambling. I've made mention of it a couple times. Actually, just going to back up a second. Here's Camp Ford as basically one of the earlier drawings, okay? It's not the elaborate plan yet, but we see different types of buildings being built. Again, this is just a lean-to structure. This would be more of a shebang. This would be like maybe more one of the elaborate, more of the elaborate type of building. But in Keno Corner, right next to where the 83rd was being positioned to eat, to drink, to get roll call, they had a gambling corner set up where men would go and they'd gamble their money away. Sutton said that Gambling is as bad as stealing in his opinion. So he was never going to gamble his money away. And actually probably saved him because he was always making money and he wasn't gambling away. But there is gambling that goes on at these prisons. They would gamble over almost anything. He doesn't take part. He thinks it's as bad as stealing. Now let's talk about how the prisoners and the extra filth, the extra waste are building up in the camp. Sutton talks to the colonel and he devises a way to remove this waste. According to him in his diary, it was his own personal thought to get a wagon in to start removing the filth. Well, they bring in a cart, the colonel grants it, they bring in a cart, they bring in a horse, and they cut 2 holes in the cart, about this size. Men would lay down flat on the cart, 2 of them at a time, laid a blanket over them, fill the cart full of the filth, the waste, take it out into the countryside, dump it, the men would take off. 2 men would escape at a time. Okay? Now, Sutton devised this plan, but Sutton's health is actually failing. He's got what they call sore eyes, okay? And his eyes are getting worse. Some men actually go blind from this. There was no antibiotics to help clean it up. And he's also got a toothache. Now, that doesn't seem like a big deal to keep a man from escaping, but when there's not a dentist, you got 1 or 2 options. Leave it in or rip it out. So Sutton does not escape. But there are a lot of escapes that go on. A couple examples of how they escape. They hide in the cart. They dig under the fence. They climb over the fence. They crawl through the sink, which is a latrine. Okay? And they also bribe guards. They pay guards for their freedom. Here are 2 pictures of an actual tunnel system. This is Camp Ford. Pay attention to 2 and 5. These are actual tunnels that men would climb out or dig underneath the fence and crawl to freedom and take off. Well, that's great, but the Confederates are very keen on roll call. Every morning they had roll call. And if you weren't there, they came looking for you. On top of that, there was an Indian tracker. And he had 15 to 30 dogs with him. And every morning he would circle the camp. And if those dogs struck your track, you were caught. Those dogs knew how to chase you down, okay? You were caught if you escaped. Here's just another example of the tunnel system. Again, 2 and 5. The other buildings here. Now, here's a picture of the Indian tracker and his dogs. If you got caught for escaping, you were punished. An example of one of the punishments was standing on top of a barrel. Okay? Other examples were you're hung up by your thumbs. Other examples, you had to march in time until sundown. So there were actual consequences to your actions. But Sutton's time at Camp Ford is growing dim. The 83rd and the Teamsters learn that they're going to be sent to Camp Gross. Sutton sells his shanty. Again, always trying to make a buck. He sells his shanty to the 96th OVI, the Ohio Volunteer Infantry. The officer's baggage is loaded up on a wagon. Well, Sutton is sick. His eyes are sore, his tooth is hurting. Sutton actually rides in the wagon. I'm just about ready to turn it over to Miss Howell, but I need to go over a couple things I didn't get to discuss. At Camp Ford, the prisoners actually printed their own paper. Here is a copy of their paper. It's called the Old Flag. This was made by the prisoners. Here's another copy of the Old Flag. And it would be distributed around the camp, and also there was cases of it going home in the mail to Cincinnati. So copies of this made it up to Cincinnati. Living conditions at Camp Ford. Okay, it's kind of dark, but you can see this man down here. They're prisoners, okay? And at first, it wasn't too bad living conditions, but the more people that came, the grosser, the dirtier it got. Again, not as bad as Andersonville in Georgia. And just one more example here. Now Miss Howe is going to be up to talk about Sutton going down to Camp Gross and the friends he meets along the way.
Thank you. I think, no offense, that was very exciting, but I think they gave me one of the most interesting parts of this book to talk about. That's good, but I get to talk about his two escapes, which, just if you've read the book, it's a really good read just because all of the situations he gets involved with, the near misses, the near captures, him eluding a couple things, so I think I get a pretty good thing to talk about here. Like Mr. Minnick was talking about, the camp is getting pretty crowded at Camp Ford, so what they decide to do in August of 1864 is they want to transfer some people. And they choose 435 men from the 83rd and also the Teamsters Division, which, while Sutton was at Camp Ford, he met the guy that he was eventually going to escape with, a man named Wilbur Pelton. And this guy was just exactly what Sutton was looking for. He was smart. He was also kind of an entrepreneur like Sutton was. They rationed. They did a really great job while they were at Camp Ford stockpiling, knowing that if they were to escape, they needed to have as many rations as possible because it's going to be some pretty rough terrain out there, and food might be scarce. So they were really preparing even at Camp Ford. Now, those 435 men get transferred to Camp Gross. And Camp Gross is a 200-mile march southwest of Camp Ford. Now, if we've got this overhead up here, they were at Tyler. They're going close to this town called Hempstead. And we're talking about a 200-mile march. They started off on August the 12th, and they finally got to Camp Gross on August the 23rd. And I would describe, again, just from the book that we've read, their first impressions of Camp Gross as being, they were horrified. I mean, Camp Ford was no Hilton by any means, but when you compare the two camps, Camp Gross was certainly in much more dilapidated, much more deplorable conditions. It was nearby a creek, and this creek was just a haven for mosquitoes. The wells in the camp, two of them had collapsed. The barracks were falling down. The latrines were overflowing. It was grown up with weeds. It was infested with fleas and lice and snakes, which of course would freak most people out. And it was bad. So I don't think it took Sutton very long to recognize that he didn't want to stay there very long. As soon as he could make a break for it, he certainly was going to do that. It was just a very, very bad run camp. And the colonel who was running that camp they called him a Yankee hater. Old Colonel at Camp Ford tended to be pretty accommodating when it came to the guys wanting to clean stuff out, or if they wanted to trade to get more goods. Colonel Gillespie, who was the commander, the head guy at Camp Gross, didn't care. The diet was really similar. The rations were pretty similar between Camp Gross and Camp Ford, with one exception. At Camp Ford, they could go out and trade to get better provisions. At Camp Gross, they couldn't. So it's not going to take very long for the prisoners inside Camp Gross to wither away to nothing. And like I said, Sutton recognizes this, and he doesn't want to stick around. At one point in time, the conditions at Camp Gross are so bad that probably, I would say around September to October, the prisoners at the camp are marched 20 miles away from Hempstead. They're marched about 20 miles north of Houston here, to a different camp. It was called Camp Fielder. Of course, I don't know. The problem was, the camp guards were afraid. There was a rumor that yellow fever was breaking out. And because they didn't want to jeopardize their own lives, they were like, heck, let's get out of here. So they moved those prisoners to this Camp Fielder, which is just, it's terrible. The prisoners are forced to sleep outside. It's wet because of the rain. It's cold. The guards and their horses actually get to sleep in the barracks. And they're there for about a month. And of the 620 men who are marching, we're going to call this a death march because that's how they're going to refer to it in the history books, of the 620 men who were marched from Camp Gross to Camp Fielder to escape the yellow fever, 120 of them died. And those who survive are in terrible, terrible shape. Now, one of the things we're going to talk about is the fact that Sutton was very lucky because he completely missed this whole death march because he had already gone out on his first escape. And luckily for him, he did, because had he been a part of that death march, who knows if he would have lived through it, because so many men didn't. The ones who died on that death march, and then the ones who actually lived but came back and just basically couldn't get healthy again. That's how bad the conditions were. In fact, Mr. Freck's going to talk a little bit about the parole in December of 1864. And of the approximately 700 prisoners at Camp Gross, 201 died or were missing. And two more prisoners were died when they were going from Confederacy, being held by the Confederate back to the Union lines. And then 11 more died while they're in these Union hospitals just because they can't get well. They've been mistreated and their health is in such ill repair that they die. So it's not great conditions. So like I said, when Sutton gets there, he's thinking, I'm not going to be here long. And he doesn't do a great job at giving us a lot of distinct timelines in the book. But I would sense, Mr. Freck and I had talked about this, that he probably didn't stay in Gross for more than a week or two. So let's say early September, he's like, I'm out of here. So he and Pelton, this guy that he's been pretty picky choosing, because he wants someone to escape with that he can count on. It's got some skills so they can complement each other. And I think Pelton was a great pick for him, and they become great friends, and I think there's a lot of mutual respect between the two men. But the night they choose to escape, it's most times when we see escapes, they want to do when it's raining outside, so that if they do successfully get outside of the prison, the rain will help deter the dogs because it's going to help alleviate the scent. So they pick a rainy night and they find a spot in the camp that's in kind of bad shape. There's a dog hole, they call it. It's a spot where dogs have gotten in and out of the camp, and they shove all they call them their traps. That's going to be their rations, their clothing, everything that they had they would carry with them. They shove that all under the dog hole, and they scale the wall and they jump over it, and they're free. And they make a decision at that point that they're going to go west. I know it sounds kind of strange because freedom is east, but they think that if they go west, they're not going to run into nearly as many Confederate soldiers. So the plan is, let's go west, let's hit the Rio Grande River, cross over into Mexico. Once we get to Mexico, we'll sail back to Louisiana and we'll be free. The problem was that escape from these prisons was nearly impossible. They were really, really far away from Union lines. They were really harsh territory, and they were in an area where the population was largely unsympathetic. And so they had to travel at night. They didn't know who they could trust. And so escape was easy. Successfully escaping back to freedom, now that was an entirely different story. But that was their plan. They were heading west. And along their journey, attempting to get west, they're always looking for opportunities to get more food. There's a cute little story where Sutton and Pelton come across this herd of cow, and there's a calf that they're like, okay, we can fall this calf and we can, cut it up and dry the meat and we'll have more food. And Pelton's going to attempt to get this cow down, and Sutton's like, what are you doing? And you can sense certainly that these two men come from very different walks of life. Sutton is a farm boy from right here, and he knows, he's experienced in how to effectively, quietly slaughter an animal. And so he kind of coaches Pelton up, and if you don't do this, you do this, and they kind of have a good laugh about how silly Pelton was attempting to go about taking down this calf, because they wanted to do it as quietly as possible so that the other, I'm not a farmer, but the mama cow wouldn't make a ruckus and come and draw attention to where they were at. But Pelton also had his own attributes. I mean, this was a very smart man. You wouldn't know it, but Mr. Freck had done some research, because in the book it reads like he's really kind of the older statesman, older and wiser and very well educated. And it turns out he was fairly young. What did he say, about 22, 23?
Well,
21. And at this point in time, Sutton is just slightly older than that. But Pelton could read the stars. I mean, he could look up at the stars and know exactly what direction they were going and get them back on track, because, like I said, they had this plan. They knew the direction they wanted to go, and they had a plan. So while you had Sutton being the smart guy who knew the land, who knew the crops, who understood, how to survive off the land, then you had Pelton, who was equally important because he was giving them the direction that they needed. And Sutton was a student too. I mean, he tried to pick up as much as he could from Pelton because, what if the two got separated, or what if something happened to Pelton? And we'll talk about that in a second. But as they attempt to get to freedom, they encounter a lot of these little stories where the wild turkey, they're always looking for beans, they're always looking for any piece of food they can get their hands on. The problem is, Pelton's pretty sick. He has been suffering from diarrhea from the beginning. I mean, some days it's better, some days it's worse, but he gets pretty weak because, like Mr. Riddick was saying, these guys are eating the same food over and over and over again, and he just could not get well. The book talks about how wild sage tea would sometimes cure his bowels and make him feel a little bit better, but the bottom line was he was pretty sick. But again, they keep going on, they keep persevering because they want to be free. They don't want to get caught. And they're fairly lucky in eluding capture. Until one time, there are some Texas Rangers that are hot on their trail. And they're just about to cross the Colorado River. See, I've got this all written down. It's on a nice outline. Then I get too excited and I get going and I'm sure I forgot to tell you some of the amazing stories about these guys. But they get close to the Colorado River here, and the Texas Rangers are following them. And they decide that they need to get in the river because, again, the hound dogs are on their trail. So they've got to get in the water to deter them being able to find them. So the one story reads how they jump in the river, and they're like floating, and there's some like driftwood right above them. And this one tracker and his dog are getting really, really close. So close that they're from you and I away from one another. And they're like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? And they've decided that since these guys are Texas Rangers, they will not surrender to them. Because they're not Confederate soldiers that don't have to abide by the same rules of war. So they both decide they're not surrendering. And if they get too close, we're going to hurt these guys. And the dog comes up within inches of Sutton's face. And that driftwood's a little unstable, and the dog takes a step and kind of stumbles, and Sutton grabs his leg and pulls him under, and he's drowning the dog. And he's making quite a fuss underneath the water, but he's like, I gotta keep this dog under here, otherwise he's gonna start barking, and they're all gonna come running our way, and this is gonna end badly. Well, the dog's master isn't too far behind, but there's Sutton with the dog underwater trying to drown him, and Pelton is like, okay, all right, I'm ready. And the man approaches the same kind of thing. His footing is a little uneasy. He's a little unsteady. He takes a step. Pelton realizes this is his chance. He grabs him and pulls him under the water, and they drown both the dog and the man. And luckily, the rest of the crew was so spread out that they never even came back looking for their partners. And afterwards, they were like, oh, we made it. That was a close call, And then Pelton's beating himself up. Why didn't I grab that guy's revolver? I can't believe it. And so they go back and forth, thought, hey, I would have loved to help you, but I got this dog in the water, and so they have a nice laugh. Unfortunately, after that incident, Pelton gets worse and worse and worse. The diarrhea comes back, and he's too weak to go. So they make a camp near the Colorado River, pretty close to this town of LaGrange, and they decide, what, let's just stay put for a while. We need to get healthy. There's no sense in traveling if you're not going to be well. So they make a little camp, and they say, we're going to stay until you're well. And at night, when Pelton's trying to recover and sleep and get well, Sutton will go out and he'll just forage. Anything that he can find, whether it's corn, whether it's melons, they're always looking for beans. That's this one thing. If they could only find beans, I think this would really help, steady their diet out a little bit. And so night after night, Sutton goes out, and he's brave. Some of the stuff that he does, I'm reading this book on, I think I would just sat at camp and remain, in a nice, safe little area. But no, he goes out and he's fighting a wild turkey, or he's, at one point, he notices there's these horses. And he's like, all right, those horses. When Pelton's ready, we're going to take those horses and we're going to ride to freedom. And so they've got a little plan devised. But again, he doesn't just lay idle while his buddy's recovering. There's one story where he stumbles across this house in the middle of the night, and the family, for whatever reason, are sleeping And from what I could gather, he thought they were probably sleeping on the porch because it was such a hot Texas night. There was no air moving inside, so they just slept on the porch to, get a little relief from the heat. So he's like, well, this is gonna be a piece of cake. I'm gonna go into this house and I'm gonna see what I can find in the kitchen or the room or whatever it is. And he goes and he's foraging around. He can't find the beans that he really, really wants. And he eventually stumbles across this like baby. Sounds like it's like a bassinet of some sort. He noticed that the family didn't really have any babies, so he assumed that this was just for storage. And guess what he finds buried inside the bassinet? Those beans. Oh, he's so proud of himself. He goes back to camp, and he and Pelton are like celebrating, like, there we go. Things look up for a little bit. But a few days later, again, Pelton gets sick. And at one point, most of the time when one would sleep, the other one would be awake just to kind of keep an eye on things so that, nobody snuck up on them. And Sutton tells a story that he was asleep, and Pelton was supposed to be keeping an eye, keeping guard. And as Sutton wakes up, there's Pelton looking at him, eyes wide open. He starts talking to his buddy. His buddy doesn't say anything back. Says a little bit more, still no response. And he realizes that this man who has become his confidant, his friend, his really true companion, has died. In the middle of the night, he's just dead. And he was, not knowing him, not knowing the relationship, I really felt when I was reading this that he was broken. He was sad. This was a tough experience. The one guy that you could count on, the guy who shared a lot of things in common with, this sense of courage and just, wanting to get back to freedom. And he's dead. And I really think that he was broken over this. And I haven't mentioned this, but Sutton wasn't in the best of health either. His eyes were, not doing so well. The diet still was not what it should have been. And he starts to get kind of sick too. Well, he buries his friend. He kind of has a dilemma. Do I bury him myself? Do I turn him over? But he says, I'm not turning this guy over because if he gets in the wrong hands, he can do anything to his body. I couldn't stand that. So he buries him himself. He marks the grave, and he decides, that's it. I'm going to get on one of those horses that we found, and I'm out of here. So he steals a horse. And it doesn't take long before two men on horseback themselves with guns start pursuing him. And there's a little bit of verbal exchange between him and the two men, like, that's Charlie Wilson's horse. Turn him over. I don't know what you're talking about. This is my horse. And they fire a shot at him. So now the chase is on. He takes off in this horse, and the horse was hit, but not mortally wounded. And now they're running. And these two men get some reinforcements. And now the two are 16. So he's like, oh crap, here it comes. This is some pretty serious stuff. When he gets far enough ahead of his pursuers, he ditches the horse and finds a little area where he can basically lie low. And believe it or not, he evades those 16 men. Now the problem is, he is sick. He's got what they call breakbone fever. And from what I can understand, this is this horrible fever that makes every joint in your body just feel like your bones are breaking, and it's hard to move, and it's bad. And he realized that if he stays there, he's going to die. So he decides he's going to go seek help. And he stumbles upon this home, and luckily enough for him, a German family lives there. This I don't know if I'd say pro-union, but certainly sympathetic to the Union forces live there. Now, it's a man, his wife, their small child, and old grandma, they call her, who speaks only German. But as he gets to this house, they obviously see that he's ill. And old grandma, now she can cure breakbone fever every time. And so she mixes him up this concoction, and they just refer to it as like this herbal concoction, herb tea, and gives him a couple doses, and believe it or not, his fever starts to break, and he does come out of it. Now, he's not completely out of the woods, but he's certainly better, and he's on the mend. The man of the house, however, is a Confederate soldier. He had been conscripted into the Confederacy. Like I said, he was really sympathetic to the Union. He was very kind to Sutton. But once Sutton recognized or realized that he was in the Confederacy, he said, you got to turn me in. No, I don't want to. No, I'm telling you, you got to turn me in. If they find out that you and your family has been harboring a fugitive, you guys are in trouble. And I will not be able to live unless, you did the right thing here, and I want you to turn me in. And so he does get turned in. Like I said, because he pressured this guy to turn him in so that the man's family wouldn't be in jeopardy. Now, in true Aaron Sutton form, before he leaves, he hands over some of his fortune to the family. He gives $10, which again, at this point in time, is a lot of money, especially in the Confederacy at this time, to the grandma, to 10 to the mom, and a little 50-cent piece to the little kid. Oh, I didn't know this happened. So he gets taken back to this area called the Brain. And he's actually handed over to another German unit that, again, is pretty pro-union. So he's in decent hands. He's being treated well. They like him. He's, from what I can gather, he's very well-spoken, and he's got a kind of a clever tongue where he can say the right thing to the right people, and he's kind of got a wit about him. And it doesn't take him long to win people over to his side. And these men who keep watching him for about a 2-week period there, they really start to like him. Now, he's not completely healed from this breakbone fever. So he's actually requested that a doctor come and see him to help him get completely better. So the doctor comes and he's like, yep, you're sick, and yep, things could get a lot worse. Well, can you give me something, Doc? No, I can't. Even if I wanted to, I couldn't give anything because the union's got that blockade. So we can't get any medical supplies. So now here he is. What am I going to do? I've just been on the brink of death. I've come back to life. I'm just fighting to return back home, and this doctor's not going to help me out. Well, in this camp that he's at, in this little, they call it like a campground area that he's at, he notices, and I'm not good with herbs and all, he notices dog fennel. Anyone familiar with dog fennel? I don't know. But he recognizes this stuff he calls dog fennel. And he remembers back home that his grandma used to use dog fennel as like this catch-all. She'd grind it up and put it in teas and herbs, and it would help cure what ailed you. So he says, well, if that doctor's not going to help me, I'm going to help myself. And he takes some of that and mashes it all up, and he puts it in what looks to me like, what sounds to me to be like a tea. And when he starts to get real sick and starts to feel the shakes coming on, he drinks this stuff. And he's better. Believe it or not, he cures himself. So then there's this rumor starting around this little area of LaGrange that Yankee, he's a doctor. All those Northerners, they know medicine. And the same family that he stole the beans from, that's what I was talking about, the man of the house has an ailment. And he hears that this Northerner at that camp is a doctor. Well, he wants him to come out and help him out. So Sutton apparently goes and to see this family like, yep, I've been in there, I've seen that room, I stole your beans. And they end up talking about it and having a big laugh about it in the end. But this man says, you got to help me out. He says, I'm not a doctor. Well, I heard you cured yourself. Well, I did, but that was a fluke, it's just something I remember from back home. I want you to help me. I can't help you. I don't know what you want from me. Please help me. And Sutton says, you know what? I'll see what I can do. Show me your sores. So he takes the bandages off and he's like, oh, that is bad. I'm not a doctor, but if those were my legs, this is what I would do. And so he goes through this whole regimen of how he would take care of himself, and he says, I hope this helps, and if not, sorry, this is the best I can do for you, and he leaves. Well, it gets back to that camp that he was at, that the man followed his directions, and his sores on his legs did get better. And I would attribute that to just common sense and knowing how to care for a wound, but that's something that he remembered and he passed on to this guy, and it helped him. I know we're running short on time here, and I don't want to bore you with too many stories, but there's one more that I thought was just hysterical because while he was, crap, I still have a second escape to talk about. I want to tell you the story about the old ladies. Almost. What's the time? How much have I got?
You're good.
Oh, these guys are like, please get me out of here. Well, there's these rich ladies want to come and they want to see this Yankee because he's kind of like a phenomenon. He's like a little celebrity there. So the camp guards really like Sutton, and so they warn him. These rich ladies and their children are going to come. They're going to look at him, and they're going to probably say some nasty stuff to you. You fire back because we know you're capable of doing it. And he's like, no, I would never speak ill to a lady. And the camp guards say, you don't know what these ladies are going to say to you. So he kind of is prepared, but he wants to play cool. He doesn't want to offend these southern ladies. So he's laying in his tent when they come, and they're peering in and saying, come out here. I'm like, well, yeah, I'm right here. No, we want to see this North. We want to see this Yankee. And then he kind of goes a little further. No, we want to see it. Camp guards, make him come out here so we can see what this Yankee looks like. Because there were stories about Yankees having horns and all these other bizarre things. And so he kind of inches his way out, but it's not good enough for him. So finally the ladies say, we want to see all of this Yankee. Make him come out here. So with that, Pelton's like, oh, you want to see everything? So he pretends like he's in pain and thing. And they're like, ah! they run, and the camp guards just laugh and laugh and laugh, and they think that Sutton is so clever for doing this. They actually, the next day, take him into town and buy him a new suit. They were so just, I think, entertained by him making these ladies blush, I guess, and drive them away, because I don't think the camp guards could stand too much anyway. They bought him a new suit. He goes back to Camp Rose. And I'm going to try to make this quick, and I apologize if I'm doing any discredit, but he goes back to Camp Rose and he finds his old buddies. And you guys remember I talked about the Death March and talked about the conditions of Camp Fielder. These guys have marched to Camp Fielder, marched back, have lived, a month and a half to 2 months in really horrific conditions, and it shows. His old bunkmate, this guy named Steele, is lying in his own filth. They talk about how he has open sores, and lice are literally feeding inside these open sores. And Sutton says how this man was such a cleanly man before, and how he can't believe that he would allow this to happen, but he recognizes that he's just so sick and so weak that he can't do anything to clean himself up. So Sutton talks about going to the camp guards and trying to get corn shucks so they can clean the beds and clean these guys up and just do whatever he can for these former friends of his who are in such horrible condition. It's while he's back at Camp Rose that he meets up with 3 other guys. A man named Thomas Seifritz, who was a German immigrant from an Indiana regiment. Peter Mullen, who was he was Irish, but he was from a Wisconsin regiment. And an 18-year-old kid named Dwayne Grout. And those are going to be the next 3 guys that he's going to escape with. And these were a real practical bunch. They, the 2, Peter and Thomas, they just sound like jokesters. They would just be joking around all the time, great storytellers. Make a long story short, they break out a night that 22 other inmates are scheduled to break out. And they decide when they get wind that these 22 guys are breaking out, it's either we go before them or we go with them, because if we go after them, the guards of the camp are going to be pretty vigilant. So they decide to go with these 22 guys, but as it turns out, the 22 men who had scheduled this original escape, it is a very, very poorly planned attempt to escape. So Sutton and his band, Tom and Pete and Dwayne, they take the lead. And again, it goes in a little more detail here, but they take the lead and they're able to get the guys out. And at this point in time, this is technically his 3rd escape, but his 2nd escape from Camp Rose. They decide to go east. And their plan this time is here they are at Hempstead. They're going to cross, they're going to follow the railroad tracks going east until they got into safe territory. The second time around, they don't have nearly as much food stockpiled. And so they've got to rely a lot more on the kindness of strangers. And they have to really gauge who's a friend and who's a foe. Initially, they encounter a black man named Tom, who they're like, no, is he trustworthy or not? And then they determine that he's a Louisiana black, and Louisiana blacks are much more trustworthy than Texas blacks. I don't know how they came to that conclusion, but Tom does end up helping them out. He gives them some food. He gives them some direction, because they need some help getting to where they're going to go, because this is unfamiliar terrain to them. This is not where they grew up. This is not something that they're familiar with, so they need as much help as possible. And they don't have Pelton to read the stars. So they encounter him. There's a nice white man, a pro-union guy, who really does a lot of good for them by, again, giving them food, giving them direction. They're following these railroad lines, and twice they went to this railroad camp where Louisiana blacks were working, because they were working on the railroad, and they would share rations with them and trade and talk and got some information from them. Now the white man that I was just talking about had given them some directions, follow this path, take this road, don't go there. And when they're following his directions, they're following him pretty close to a T, but then this big dog comes out of nowhere and bark and bark and bark, and they don't want to avoid him because they don't want too much commotion, because that's going to draw attention. So they have to go out and around. And when they do that, they get off track. And when they get off track, they had actually crossed paths or had gone by a home that a free black was living at. And before you know it, 17 men with weapons are hot on their trail. They surround him, they capture him. This is the 2nd time. They later find out that this free black man saw them, reported them, and as they're being taken back to eventually Houston for their imprisonment, they encounter him and they say, when this war is over, we're going to find you. Because how dare you? Here we are fighting for, to end this horrific institution of slavery, and you have the audacity to turn us in. Now, I'm not sure if it was that pleasant of an exchange, but they got a piece of him, and because of his, and decided to turn him in. I'm about to turn it over to Mr. Freck here, but when they get back to this Houston prison, they get word that the prisoners at Camp Gross, where they left probably about a month ago, they're being paroled. So they're like, oh, finally, there's an end to this torture. And they ask if they can be paroled along with their buddies. Well, that offer is denied, and so they're sent back to Camp Gross, but only for a short period of time. This is like the beginning of December. By December 19th, they've gotten their own parole papers, and they're heading back home. And this is where Mr. Freck's going to take over, and I'm sure I missed some life story, but anyway.
That is his parole papers. They're out as of the middle of December. They are paroled. One thing I wanted to mention, the last thing he says in the book is that for his, and it's a real piece of reality, said the whole difference in my imprisonment from other imprisonments is that I had money. You know, if that was what pulled me through. This is, again, this releases him. He's released back to the Army. When we're taking a look at what these guys look like, this is guys coming out of Gross and Camp Ford. This is what they look like at that time. And there it is. That, of course, is a big difference from that. Camp Gross and Camp Ford, another example of a guy coming out. This is what they look at coming out of those camps. This next one is kind of hard. This is what people look like coming out of Andersonville. But that's why when you look at Camp Ford, 285 people out of the 5,000 plus at Camp Ford died. 285. 200 out of 700, 200, well, plus the ones right afterward. Out of 700 at Gross died. At Andersonville, 13,000 died out of 40,000. It's up there close to places like Dock. If you go by percentages, though, actually, the percentage of people dying at Gross is pretty close to that at Andersonville. They're dealing with a lot fewer people. He's heading back in. You'd think the Army would give him a break, but they take his regiment and send it right back into combat. They send him, these guys returning, and they're sent down to a place in Alabama, Fort Blakely, that their corps, now he had been in the 13th Corps, now he's in the 19th Corps. But they are involved in taking this Fort Blakely. You can see the particular area attacked by the 83rd. Actually, the only guy in the 83rd who won a Medal of Honor won it at the Battle of Blakely, at taking Fort Blakely. It's in one of the other companies. But that is the last major combat of the war for them. This is in April, and the war will finish very soon afterward. They, as the war finishes up, as we look at Mr. Sutton, the regiment, this gives you an idea of battle and field conditions in the Civil War. Starting out with 1,010 men. Quite a few of the men are disabled. They don't make it to the end of the war. But the total battle casualties are 53 men killed. The total disease casualties are 163. It was much more dangerous back during the Civil War to be in camp than it was to be in combat. we are taking a look, we're historians, so we look at this book, we review it. And we review it in two ways, literary and historical. Literary, this book is a good read. It's a very easy, good read. It is, you get a chance, read it. About 170 pages. It's got a really folksy style to it. The main character, if we're going literary-wise, is very likable, very energetic, endearing. As compared, and this is where we get into this story about them, this wagon story. And the wagon story is a problem. You know, in the book, he talks about going to the colonel, talking to the colonel, and getting after, and it says within a few hours after talking to the colonel, they get this wagon. Well, when you look at it historically, the colonel, when Sutton gets there, it's April 15th. The colonel is removed from command May 15th. He's gone. And this little problem he gets into, he's calling this, and names get mixed up, and again, after 26 years, this is going to happen. 26 years, names are going to be. Allen is the colonel. The man who replaces him, his name is Anderson. Colonel Anderson. Colonel Scott Anderson. Colonel Scott Anderson, May 15th, Colonel Scott Anderson replaces Colonel Robert Allen. Scott Anderson, now he uses this term, as Mr. Minnick mentioned, the old colonel, Scott Anderson is their age. But what's wrong with this? You know, this is what led to the wagon. This is what led to the wagon. On June 14th, Tyler, Texas, the Confederate Surgeon General, the Confederate surgeon of the camp, did an inspection of the camp conditions. And with that inspection, that's when you get the wagon doing the cleaning up. And again, the wagon, almost every one of the diaries then has the wagon. They all have the wagon. It's a very common story. But this is what led to the wagon, and you get the date up here is June 14th. This is when Anderson's there, much younger man. This is when they start to use the wagon. The wagon comes as a result of this report about filth and offal being all over the streets, and it needs to be cleaned up again. So you have an individual story like that gets to be a problem. There's another one that we ran into. There is and this shows up in more than one of the historical accounts. There is at Camp Ford a Reverend Lamb. And Reverend Lamb is hated by the Confederates. He is despised by the Confederates because he'd been a chaplain for a black regiment. It's a white guy it's a black, serving the black troops, and that sets Confederates on. And his life in his camp is hell. He's always being persecuted by these rebels because of that. There is a story in the book, right toward the end, where right when Sutton is being released, Reverend Lamb is being threatened. He's being threatened with execution. And he is given, in the book, he gives Corporal Sutton a letter to take back to the to the Union side, trying to get himself, trying to get himself saved, because they want to kill him. And so that letter is carried back. Corporal Sutton carries that letter back to New Orleans when he's released. And he takes that letter, and this lamb is he's very specific about this lamb. He says this lamb was from New Orleans himself, but he had family that lived on Race Street in Cincinnati. So he brings this letter back with him. And in the book, as soon as we landed in New Orleans, I hunted up General Dwight and gave him the letter to read. I explained the situation more fully. He asked a few questions and then sent a telegram to the forts at the mouth of the Mississippi. From there, it was signaled to Galveston Bay, to our fleet that was guarding the bay, and soon Reverend Lamb was able to arrive in New Orleans. He carried that to General Dwight. This is General Dwight. General Dwight had been Nathaniel Banks' chief of staff. The problem is that this guy had been transferred to the east in July of 1864. He had been sent, he was back serving with the Army of the Shenandoah during that time. He is back under Phil Sheridan. Now, what I personally think happened in each one of these cases, I think that Corporal Sutton did complain about that, about the conditions, that after a while, those complaints and other people's complaints led to the conditions being improved. I believe that he carried the letter back, that he gave it to somebody that he didn't have the personal contact with the general, obviously. But in both cases, I believe he did what he said, or he did in part what he said, but that he kind of expanded his role a little beyond what we can justify from what we see in history. We look at the escapes. The escapes, hey, they hold up very well. This is the last prison. It is the story of Camp Gross. Mr. Sutton is mentioned. Mr. Sutton is mentioned in it. When you're quoting stats, 26 guys from the 83rd were captured. 6 of them died. I don't know.
I didn't say that, no.
But again, in a very researched book here, you can see Mr. Sutton given the credit for his 2 escapes. And we do these things historically. We go back and we look at the Adjutant General's reports on the regiments of the guys he served with. Mrs. Howell mentioned Dwayne Grout. She mentioned Thomas Seifritz. In their rosters, they're described as they escaped and were recaptured, just like in the book. These reflect very much what the book says. These guys escape and are recaptured and are returned. This is, again, the Pelton family, out of the Pelton family history. And it talks about how, and again, this reinforces the account in the book. This talks about how Wilbur Pelton escaped from prison with a comrade, died, and his comrade, just like in the book, buried him by near LaGrange. Again, these different accounts very much reflect what's in the book about the escapes when we check them out historically. So again, there are some things in the book that are questionable. There are other things. The major parts of the story about the escapes are very much reflected and supported by history. Of these people, Seifritz lives another, he lives well into his 70s. The other 2 guys didn't have as much life as finding their lives. It mentions, the only guy it mentions him having contact with after is a guy named James Riley, who'd been in the prison with him, engrossed with him. But when we look, he has a lot of continuing contact with the men in his regiment, and in some cases with these guys who he was in prison with. In 1905, he participates in a dedication of a memorial to the victory at Vicksburg. It's done right at the 40th anniversary of the end of the war. And you have 10 men selected representing different companies in the 83rd. And you can see right here, A. T. Sutton representing. But he was down for the dedication of this memorial. It was a big deal. The governor of Ohio was down there to speak, Myron Herrick, and it was dedicated down in Vicksburg. That's the monument. This gives kind of a better view of it, a little easier to see. But again, you can see, the emblem of the 83rd, the Greyhounds. That he participated in that. In 1912, the 50th anniversary of the formation of the regiment, he is on the list of members of the regiment at that time. Two other guys who've been in Camp Gross with him are still on the regimental list too. James Gray and Henry Romer, who'd been a sergeant. So you have this continuing contact with some of these men that long past their time of service. You see that he is involved, when you look back at the newspaper accounts, even up into the 1920s, he's involved in organizing Memorial Day celebrations up here. And that's why he's well into his 80s. This is the obituary. There's the obituary as it appeared in the Rockford Press when he died in July of 1927, giving a description of his escapes. And we have a lingering image there if we look at his grave. At his grave, that remembrance of the war. When you look on his grave, the emblem of the 83rd. Interesting story to read, fascinating character, a lot of resiliency, a lot of strength, and gave us a valuable document.
Where is it there? Where is the grave?
Not at what? Mount Olive.
Olive.
Mount Olive.
You're on
Yeah.
117.
Right. Is there any comments or questions?
I have a picture.
Oh, you have a picture there?
A picture in,
Oh, wow.
I think that's at the dedication.
Is this the one down in 1905?
Yes.
The one? Yeah. Good looking man.
He also had a brother, David Sutton, who died at Andersonville.
Oh, really? They both had prison experience. I hate to say somebody got a break, but I think
Yeah,
going through those prisons might have been a little bit better situation.
I was surprised he never made any mention of that in his book, of his brother dying at Anderson.
Yeah. He very much concentrated, there's just a little bit about his experiences before and a very short bit about afterward, and it does the title, Prisoner of a Rebel in Texas. That's what it's about.
migrated up here to Mercer County from Hamilton County.
Is that why you had
And,
the,
and out here on 117, at 117 and 127, where Johnsons live today, that's where he lived. He built a 2-story house there, and the Johnsons tore it down and built that little ranch they have there.
That's the house they tore down.
yeah, this, here we go. This is,
Yeah,
this is,
Now, what regiment, let me ask the question, what regiment did Aaron's brother join if he wasn't in 83rd Ohio?
I don't know.
yeah, this is,
I never knew this till just a few short years ago, that he had a brother that died in Andersonville.
wow.
Like I guess-
That's like, you know, irony here.
But I visited Andersonville, and they have tombs down there that are right side by side. And
Yeah.
he's there. His name's there.
Oh, his name's on one of the two?
Yeah.
I can't remember the number.
Said, Mrs. Agler said that, what, that was the room that he died on, right there, that was the.
I have a question for Mr. Minnick. You told us to remember the 3 graves. How long do we have to remember them?
Well, actually, I made mention of it, but you're right, I never came back to it. The 3 graves that I showed they were made an example of, you know, when I talked about the guards, and more importantly, that 12-year-old boy who promised his mother that he was going to kill a Yankee before he returned home. This is just an example how 3 people were shot and put on display pretty much right there in the prison camp at Camp Ford. Thank you for reminding me of my shortfalls.